$50,000 aside at age 30. At age 70, it would be worth $2.3 million. And when you start beginning to understand what we're going to be discussing with wealth management is you need to manage your money today so that it's going to be able to care for you in the future. And we're going to say, is that biblical? Is it biblical for me to have $2 million at age 70? Well, obviously, if you were wise and you were prudent, then yes. But we will get to there. But I want to give you an idea that this concept of wealth management is real. But now let's ground it into the scriptures. Is it biblical? And tomorrow morning, I will walk you through a strategy. Notice I said the word a, not the strategy. A strategy that will allow you to be able to have financial security and financial independence as you approach retirement in a biblical way in the midst of inflation and everything else that you're looking at. We'll look at some of that tomorrow. So you can batter me with questions. If one wants to know what my background is, I was a certified financial planner. I got tired of the continuing professional education. I am also a CPA, a certified public accountant, so I have a lot of financial background. But I like teaching everything from a biblical basis. So let's start there. Some of you will say, why should we study wealth management? Really, what does the Bible have to say about wealth management? It may surprise you to know that 2/3 of the parables that Christ taught dealt with money or finance. Thus, we're going to begin this discussion knowing that this is a relevant topic for us to look at biblically. In the next 2 sessions, I'm going to kind of lay out some principles tonight. Saving, investing, debt. So it's not super practical, but you get the chance in the second hour to ask practical questions based upon those principles. And then tomorrow, as I said, in the morning, for about 45 minutes, I'm going to walk you through a strategy. Then you can batter me with questions about how to make that work. So we're going to do that. So that gives you an idea of kind of where we're going over the next 2 days. As we begin this discussion, there's 4 foundational concepts that I need you to cover because we got to be on the same wavelength with terms. Because oftentimes there's a tendency in the Christian movement to look at a particular verse and apply that verse as if it's law when it may not be law. And I'll make that distinction. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the difference between precept and principle, and then the difference between ownership and stewardship. A precept. A precept is an absolute command from the Lord. As the handout will show you, the extent of the precept is fixed. It doesn't float. Which Josh McDowell says this best. A precept applies to all people, at all times, and in all places. The reward for following a biblical precept is always a blessing. The consequence for violating a biblical precept is always a punishment. And the danger in not following a biblical precept is the commission of a sin. So let's give an example of a precept. Exodus 20:15. You shall not steal. That's a precept. It applies to all people at all times in all places. Now, a principle is different. A principle, borrowing again from Josh McDowell's book, Truth Matters, a principle is a norm or a standard that may be applied in more than one situation. A principle describes a fundamental truth on which a precept or law is based. For example, the respect for life that comes is the principle of respect for life is what bolsters the command, you shall not kill. Honesty bolsters, you shall not bear false witness. So but the extent of a principle is somewhat indeterminate, okay? It may or may not apply in all circumstances. A precept applies in all circumstances. A principle may not. So the reward for following a principle is usually a blessing. The consequence is usually a punishment. And the danger of not following a principle is the possibility of sin. In Proverbs 15:22, we read, as an example, without consultation, plans are frustrated, but with many counselors, they succeed. Well, that's not a precept. It doesn't apply in all circumstances. It's a principle. A person who develops a plan by himself or herself often sees that plan frustrated, whereas if a person develops a plan and seeks out wise counselors, it usually succeeds. Why? It's a biblical principle that wise counsel improves the likelihood of a plan succeeding. So what is the importance of this distinction between principle and precept? As you go through wealth management, you must identify what the biblical passage that we're considering, is it a precept or a principle? And it's only when you've made that determination that you can determine its extent, its applicability, and the possible outcomes if we choose to obey or disobey. I'm emphasizing this because there are a lot of Christian teachers out there who will try and tell you that saving is a biblical command. Okay, well, it's not. It's a biblical principle. It's wise. There are going to be others who will say, you cannot ever borrow money. Well, they'll teach it that as if that's a precept. But borrowing money, there are many passages in the scriptures where it talks about people borrowing money. So borrowing money can be good or bad depending on how you borrow it, but to borrow money is not a sin. So that's why it's important for you to always ask this question when someone teaches you a principle, a biblical statement, is it a command, precept, or is it a principle? So that's why I wanted to emphasize that. Second, ownership and stewardship. As to ownership, God owns it all. David writes in the 24th Psalm, the earth is the Lord's and all it contains, the world and those who dwell in it. God owns everything. Paul even writes in 1 Corinthians 4, what do you have that you did not receive? So God is the ruler, the owner, the sovereign, and the king. An example of how this applies is the infamous concept of the tithe. We hear a lot being taught on the tithe. Some people have the notion that the Lord is entitled to 10% of our income. That's what's called the tithe. And the rest belongs to us. But this is simply not true. God owns 100% of what we have. That's the owner. But we are stewards. Job writes in Job 1:21, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I shall return there. The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. We are the slaves that are taught in Matthew 25. For it is just like a man about to go on a journey who called his own slaves and entrusted his possessions to them. Everything is owned by God, so we are not the owners. What we possess is what we are stewards or managers. And that's why everything that we have is actually a loan from Him to us. So what is the implications of this second set of ownership and stewardship? First and foremost, this is very important, Every financial decision is a spiritual decision. Waste, for example, is not squandering of our resources. It's a poor use of His resources. And second, we need to thank the Lord for His provision. Worthwhile expenditures, vacations, food, transportation, housing are purchased with His money. Thus, we must be grateful for His provision. So now we got those foundational concepts aside. Now I want you to look at what I call our 7 foundational precepts and principles that will govern our conversation, okay? Some of them are commands, but most of these are principles. Number 1, a lot of these will be applied in the questions I put. So please take a look at the breaks of some of those questions if some of them interest you or variations of those interest you. We'll get there. Number 1, budgeting. What budgeting is matching up anticipated revenues with anticipated expenses, okay? There is no biblical command to budget. Scripture merely says that the wise plan or budget by matching costs to available resources. I'm going to read from Proverbs 27, verses 23 through 27. Know well the condition of your flocks, and give attention to your herds. For riches do not last forever, and does a crown endure to all generations? When the grass is gone and the new growth appears, and the vegetation of mountains is gathered, the lambs will provide your clothing, and the goats the price of a field. There will be enough goats, milk for your food, for the food of your household, and maintenance for your girls. That is, of course, if you plan wisely. In order to plan wisely requires that you budget. It's a principle, not a command. Number 2, saving. Saving is the process of spending less than what you make and setting that amount aside for future use. You will hear this several times in answers to the question. I would encourage, I would challenge you, this includes the young people in the room, to live at about 75 or 80% of what you bring in. The balance is set aside for emergencies, which will happen, retirement, and future expenses that you may very well need. Because if you're in a 2-bedroom, 1-bath house, and you decide you're going to have a 4th child or a 5th child, you might decide there might need to be a little bit of a larger house. Well, you might need to save money towards that. Well, how are you going to do that? You got to live well below what you're bringing in. Okay? So, saving. The Bible teaches that the wise and diligent save, and the sluggard and the foolish do not. If I were to look at one verse, Proverbs 21:20, and it says it pretty clearly. Precious treasure and oil are in a wise man's dwelling, but a foolish man devours it. The wise saves, the foolish devours it. We could also look at Proverbs 24:20, verse 4. The sluggard does not plow in the autumn. He will seek at harvest and have nothing. Because he didn't save. He didn't do the work. So the wise and diligent slave save, the sluggard and the ant do not. We could also look, and you've heard the story in Proverbs of the ant. I won't read that for you. But the ant, who's considered to be wise, prepares, what we just said, the food in the summer and gathers the provision in the harvest. But even more, the ant, having no chief, ruler, or officer, they're a self-starter. In contrast, the sluggard is the exact opposite. The sluggard chooses not to plow after the harvest, which is very important, and as a result will have nothing at the next harvest time. So Proverbs 21:20 states it very clearly. The wise save and have precious treasure and oil in their dwelling. The fool does not, they consume all that they have. Saving is wise. It's not a command, but you really have a choice. You're either wise or you're what? Foolish, okay? The only choices you got. So if you don't want to save, you're being foolish. Investing, number 3. Investing is a process of laying out money or capital with the intent of obtaining income or profit. Though the Bible is not particularly, it's very clear about saving, it's a little vaguer about investing. But I would appeal to you to the story in Matthew 25, the parable of the talents. Okay? So the master gives one person what? 10 talents, right? 5, 1, okay? So here's the interesting thing. Ultimately, the one with 10 comes back and has earned 10 more. The one that had 5 earned 5 more. And the one that had 1 just had interest. How in the heck did the one that had 10 get 10 more? You couldn't do it going to the bank and just getting interest on it. What did he have to do? And I teach this in my intro to finance class that I'm a professor at. You know what's interesting about that? He had to actually invest those 10 to earn 10 more. And he was rewarded for putting the 10 at risk to earn 10 more. And the one that had 5 was rewarded for putting 5 at risk. So is investing biblical? Well, yeah. It's not commanded, but again, it's wise. And that's going to be very, very important because you're going to find some people, Christians said, you don't put money in the stock market. Okay. What are you going to put it in order to invest that money? Well, then go buy hard assets. That's great. You can go buy houses, and the house prices, unless here in the valley, it's different than the rest of the state. House prices keep climbing, right? They don't seem to want to go down. But if you buy assets, the assets can appreciate. You want to invest your money. And that's very wise. Number 4, contentment. This is a precept. This is not a principle. The biblical precept is we are to be content with what we have. Philippians 4 says we're to be content in all circumstances. Hebrews says we're to be free from the love of money. Proverbs 30, verse 7 through 9, we're to seek neither wealth nor poverty. Contentment is a precept. We are required to be content. That plays into wealth management because what drives a lot of poor wealth decisions is a discontent. I don't have enough. I don't have enough clothing. I don't have a nice car. I don't have a big enough house. What drives a lot of poor financial decisions is the failure to be content. Debt, number 5. This is a mixture of a precept and a principle. So I'm going to be very careful. I apologize. Credit, okay, is the establishment of a mutual trust relationship between a lender and a borrower. So when Citibank says, Mark, you can have this credit card, that credit card is given to me because I have demonstrated I have a guaranteed income stream to pay off whatever I borrow against it. Okay? Or I have assets I can pledge where we could sell the assets and pay off what I've done. So it's a relationship. Credit is a relationship. An example of credit is this credit card. Okay? Or maybe if you have a business, a monthly cash flow line. You know, if you've ever owned a business and you know timing-wise, you have to pay people's salary on the 15th and the 31st, but your income from your customers kind of does this. Well, they'll sometimes loan you cash to make sure your employees are being paid because you've demonstrated that over the course of 12 months, you will bring in more money than you're going to borrow to pay out. And so that's why you can do that. That's a line of credit. Now here's where you get it. Debt is not credit. Debt is not credit. Debt is a condition when you have insufficient income to meet a loan commitment, or you have insufficient collateral to satisfy the loan agreement. Perfect example. If I have a $100,000 house that I want to buy, and I were to go out and they'll let me borrow $70,000 or $80,000 towards that if I put some money down, right? But would they let me borrow $200,000 for a $100,000 house? No. Because if I sold my house, I still would owe them more money. And so I would be in debt. I want you to just keep that in the back of your mind. So if you are using a credit card and cannot pay the balance off at the end of each month, you immediately are now in debt. They were loaning you money just so that, I don't know how about you, but I don't like carrying, maybe some of you do, I don't like carrying cash. So I go to the gasoline, I pay with a credit card. I go to the grocery store, I pay with a credit card. But at the end of each month, I pay my credit card off in full because I never spend more than I had available. But there are many people who cannot afford what that they're putting on their credit card, and they immediately go into debt. And the scriptures aren't going to speak very highly of that. If you got a credit card and you're paying that money off on a monthly basis, sweet. That's great. But if you're not able to pay that off, then you are entering a condition of debt. And so what does the Bible have to say about debt? Number one, in all three cases, I'll give you three things that it says about it, but the Bible is strongly opposed to any concept of debt. First of all, under Deuteronomic law, Israel was blessed and obedient if they didn't borrow from the other nations, but they were cursed and disobedient if they borrowed from other nations. Number two, when the Bible speaks about debt, it speaks about the fact that the borrower has an absolute commitment to repay money that is borrowed. Thus, if you fail to repay money you borrow, it is a sin. Well, I all of a sudden I lost my job and I had this much money on my credit card. Well, I hate to tell you this. Raise your hand. How many of you have lost a job once in your life? Okay. How many of you lost more than once in your life? Okay. That's going to happen. So you should not run up debt without the background of being able to cover that. And that's why it's very important. You have an absolute commitment as a believer to repay that's borrowed. Number three, the scripture said, they liken a borrower to be in the same state, this is in Proverbs 22:7, as a slave is controlled by a wealthy master. When you are in debt, you are a slave. You're in slavery to whoever you have borrowed the money from. The scriptures don't like debt. So let me now give you 8 reasons why you should not like debt, or 8 reasons why you want to avoid debt. Number 1, debt presumes on the future. When people commit themselves to payments over a period of time, they're presuming there will be no pay reductions, no loss of job, no unexpected expenses, which is pretty improbable given the fact that Proverbs says, do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring forth. Debt presumes on the future. Number 2, debt lowers your future standard of living. Money that is borrowed today must be repaid along with interest, which means that the things that you purchase with credit or debt will cost more tomorrow than if you'd just been able to buy them today. Therefore, your standard of living actually will drop. Number 3, debt focuses on facade decisions rather than real life decisions. Debt encourages people to make decisions based on whether they can afford a monthly payment rather than whether they can afford the total cost. Debt makes it too easy to say yes to low monthly payments while ignoring the real cost of the items. Number 4, debt leaves people at the mercy of the power of compound interest. I'm going to give you the opposite of what I opened with today. If consumers pay the minimum monthly payment on a $1,000 debt at the credit card rate of 19.8% and never charge anything else on that account, but you only pay off the minimum monthly payment, it would take you 8 years to pay off that $1,000, and you will have paid over $2,000 in total for the $1,000 you borrowed. Number 5, debt delays God's plan. God said that He would provide for His people's needs. Debt allows needs to be met now from a means other than what God has provided. Debt provides instant gratification at the expense of financial freedom rather than waiting on God's perfect plan and His perfect timing. I really, really, really want to go skiing. But if I don't have the money to go skiing, because God has not provided enough income coming in, and I'm just going to put it on my credit card and pay it off over the next year or two, it may have been that I probably shouldn't have gone skiing. Because if I really was, I would have had enough in savings to be able to pay for it without having to borrow to go skiing. Number 6, debt clouds the line that separates wants, desires, and needs. Food, clothing, shelter, medical coverage, transportation, those are needs. Wants are the quality of the goods. You know, I might be able to afford to go to McDonald's, but I might not be able to afford to go for a $75 per person steak restaurant. Discount shopping versus specialty shopping, steak versus chicken, new car versus a good used car, those are where wants are. And desires are those things that can be purchased only after all other obligations are met and if there are surplus things. Only if I have saved enough money can I meet all of my desires. The problem is debt allows desires to become wants and wants to become needs. Number 7, debt encourages impulse buying and overspending. The CFO of a national credit card company said that consumers spend on average 25 to 30% more when they charge than when they write a check or a cash. I had the privilege of being able to set aside a sum of money for my first 2 or 3 children towards college. I was able to because of some blessings that the Lord gave me, so I had one that I'd set money aside for them. It wasn't enough money to go for 4 years. It was not enough. They were still going to have to work and get scholarships, and we weren't going to let them borrow any money. But I took that money and I put it in their checking account. And someone said, why would you do that? I mean, they might just go blow it all. They can go blow it. It's their money. That's all they get towards college. But you want to know what the difference is? When that first bill came in the first semester, and mom or dad was paying for the bill, that was someone else's money. But all of a sudden, their checking account just dropped like by 25%. And they went, man, that's my money. So the difference is debt encourages overspending. When you have to actually put out real cash or pay a check to something, and it's even like a debit card. You know, if you've got $200 on your debit card and you just burn through that and you don't get $200 more until next month, and it's the 20th of the month, you're going to go some lean times. And I had one daughter, that's how she lived her life. She was all in on spending money. And inevitably what would happen is about 7 to 10 days before the end of the month, she would be, oh, woe is me. I can't go out. I can't afford to buy gas. I can't do this. I can't buy that. Well, why? Because I've spent all my money because she couldn't borrow. So she had to live on what she had. That's why debt encourages impulse buying and overspending. Number 8, debt stifles resourcefulness. I want what I want, when I want, and how I want, right? But the problem is that you need to learn to be more resourceful. Now, I am going to make a shout out that would be politically incorrect in North Central Texas. But here in South Texas, you guys are much more resourceful than North Central Texans. And there are a large number of you who know how to work on cars. Up in North Central Texas, they look at it like it's magic. I don't know what happens up there. And the beauty is that there's an ethos here in South Texas of being resourceful. And I want to encourage you all to continue to be resourceful because you can do more things and you can keep things running and you can fix things that break. And I commend you for that because that's what most of the country was like 50 years ago. But nowadays, no one knows how to do anything. But as you come here into South Texas, you guys are much more resourceful. But debt is why a lot of people aren't resourceful because they don't know what to do, so they just borrow it. You know, when one of my children, when they needed new furniture, they had 2 choices. Well, I'll give them 3 choices. Number 1 is I could save money and then go buy furniture. Or I could leave the room empty, for 3 or 4 months. Or I could go out to some flea market and get something that could be used for $50 or $100 to buy time. Or I could borrow and go get $5,000 worth of furniture and pay it off over the next 6 months. So you can guess what they did. They went and borrowed $5,000 instead of being resourceful. Because you will find that there are a lot of options for furniture that is a lot less expensive if you just ask around and you look on Etsy or you look on eBay and so forth. So be resourceful. Note, this is why debt is so dangerous. No one who is financially bound can be spiritually free. It's impossible to move and sell your home. Like, I have a great job in San Antonio, doubling my income. But I can't sell my house because I'm underwater. It's worth less than what I borrowed it for, and I don't have the cash to pay it off because you're in debt. It's impossible to move, sell your home, downsize your home, change careers if you're in financial bondage. If you want to be free to serve God as He calls you, you have to be free financially. And financial bondage inevitably leads to spiritual bondage. We now move to the 6th principle. This will be very quick. Surety. Surety is accepting an obligation to pay without having a guaranteed way of making payments. The best example of surety is co-signing. The Bible basically says if you co-sign for someone not outside your family, you are stupid. You're foolish. Do not co-sign for anyone else. If you want to co-sign for your children, that's okay because the family is the one who will have to make the sacrifices when those payments come due. But surety is not looked on favorably by the Scriptures because it's largely opposed to that. Giving, principle number 7, the last one. What does the Old Testament teach about giving? It teaches about tithes. It teaches about first fruits. It even teaches you several tithes. I just want you to know, everyone in the New Testament today says the Old Testament had a 10% tithe. They didn't read the Old Testament very well. There were 3 different tithes in the Old Testament, and that actually equated to 23 1/3% if you were following Old Testament law. So The Old Testament taught that about giving. Are Old Testament giving practices today, are you required to give 23 1/3% as a New Testament believer? The answer is no. Those laws are no longer applicable, and any proof texts on tithing, which everyone loves, Micah and some others, just kind of smile at them and say, whoever's teaching this just doesn't understand New Testament giving. But what does the New Testament teach about giving? And you will see in your handout, it is very rich in what it teaches. The New Testament teaches about giving. It says in 2 Corinthians, you are to give cheerfully. You are to give regularly in 1 Corinthians. You're to give willingly. You are to give generously. You are to give sacrificially. You are to give according to your means. You are to give quietly, and you are to give immediately. But some of you are going, okay, that's great. I mean, you just gave me a bunch of Bible verses and saying this is how I'm supposed to give in the New Testament. But I want more specifics. I need something more concrete. I need to know how much to give. I need to know what kind of housing I should buy. I need to know what standard of living I should strive for. Let me just give you a handful of guidelines from the Scriptures that you can apply. These are not commands or precepts. They're principles. When assessing how much to give, you should give as to needs. In Ruth 2, Boaz came to visit the reapers working in his field. He immediately notices a stranger trailing after the reapers, and he inquires about him. And let me just read this story. Boaz was attentive and interested because he wanted what was best for people. He noticed the new person among the workers and regular gleaners. If he had been a different kind of man, he might not even have noticed this person. But he was immediately attentive because he was always attentive to people and what God was doing in their life. He also was anxious to find out what God was doing and how God might bless the people he encountered. A different sort of man might have been complaining, we have too many gleaners already. Why doesn't she go to someone else's field? I'd like more crops. I don't want to let her do this. But Boaz asked the question because he wanted to bless. Once he found out who Ruth was, it got better. He heard her story, and this was the Moabitess who loved God and served Naomi. He knew God wanted to reward people like that, to do good to people who loved him. How should we give? We should give in a manner similar to Boaz. We should be God-saturated people, aware of what's going on around us. And when we hear of specific needs, we should address them, even if that means it's sacrificial to us. Number 2, as to your standard of living, I've already spoken to this. It is wise to live below your standard, your potential income, so that you are actually living at a lower standard of living than what you might be able to afford. The big question is not how much money should I give to support the kingdom of God, but how much of God's money should I keep to support me, my family, and my lifestyle? I make this much money, I don't have to live at that standard, because what God is actually challenging us to say, could we live at this standard and give this much away? As to taking on financial obligations, we need to live a disciplined life in order to be free. That means removing any and all restrictions that keep us from giving. We should avoid high mortgage payments, any debt, expensive possessions, toys, more toys. And remember, we have to avoid debt at everything. If we really want to be spiritually free, we can't be financially bound. So we need to be very wise in not taking on financial obligations that dig us in a hole. As to the amount of how much we should give, God does not give us wealth in order to lavish us in an abundant measure upon ourselves, but that we might share it with others. There is a lot of prosperity gospel teaching that's out there that if I give more, God's going to bless me more so that I can live at a higher standard of living. I would want you to change and look after the example of those who, when they made this much money and then their income goes up here, guess what standard of living they stayed at? And they started giving away larger and larger sums of money. As to the specific amount of our giving, even though there's no specific command in the Scriptures, and though there is no applicability to the Old Testament requirements, I would argue that 10% is your starting point. That you should be looking at probably giving away 10%. And then as your income goes up, your percentage can go up. There's no command, but that appears to be a wise principle that we can follow. Okay, we have arrived at 7 o'clock. So now we have a lot to discuss, and now you can start battering away after the break a lot of questions.
So we are going to end by 8 o'clock. So the faster this break is, the more time we have for Q&A. I guarantee you everyone's going to be like, I wish we had 10 more minutes. And so let's take a 10-minute break, but like actually a 10-minute break. You can go to the bathroom. There's going to be some snacks and drinks and things like that in the fellowship room. If you have a question, I have a couple questions that I'm wanting to ask just to get them talking. Y'all ask questions in your forms. So I have some questions. If you have one that you're like, we definitely want to cover this tonight, tell me it during the break so I make sure that we cover that one. Otherwise, after I ask a few questions, I'll open it up to y'all, and y'all can ask them as well. All right. So 10 minutes, and we're back in here for the Q&A with Mark and Debbie.